You can start.
Okay. All right. Parshas Lecha. And Parshas Lecha begins by talking about the command that Avram received from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Lech Lecha me'artzecha me'moladcha beis avicha la'aretz hasharecha, to leave his father's house and to go to the land that HaKadosh Baruch Hu would show him, which ultimately was Eretz Yisrael, or Eretz Canaan, as it was called in those days. And what transpired, he went together with Lot, together with the Nefesh HaSharasu B'charan, which according to our sages were the people upon whom he had an influence. And of course he took Sarah, his wife, with him, and his nephew Lot. And then it talks about various things that happened, and the Sedra more or less concludes with the Bris Milah. And I want to discuss what I think is the essence of this Sedra. Now, in the middle of the Sedra, the Torah tells us about how Lot, how Abraham had to go down to Egypt, and what happened with Sarah in Egypt. And then when they returned, a fight broke out between the shepherds of Lot and the shepherds of Avram. And ultimately, Avram tells Lot, why should there be a fight between us? We're related, we're relatives, we're Achim. And it would be more appropriate that we separate our ways, that I go one area, you go another area. And ultimately, Lot settles near Sdom, and it seems that he becomes part of the society of Sdom. And then a war breaks out between the 5 kings and 4 kings. The 4 kings had control, were getting taxes from the countries of the 5 kings. Really, it wasn't in those days, it wasn't so much countries as cities. And ultimately, they rebelled and stopped sending the taxes. And then the 4 kings organized a counter revolt, or whatever you want to call it, and they were successful. And the king of Sdom was one of the 5 kings. And of course, the people of Sdom were taken captive. The king was taken captive. And together with the people of Sdom that were taken captive by the 4 kings was Lot, the nephew of Avraham Avinu. And then Avraham Avinu receives word that his nephew Lot was captured, even though they parted ways. Nevertheless, Avraham organizes an army from among his servants, and they go and free Lot. And in the process, and it's very interesting, when the Torah tells us about Avram being notified about what happened to Lot, it says the Polit, the person who escaped, there were medrashim as to who it was, but the person who escaped came to reform Avram ha'Ivri, Avram the Hebrew. And Chazal say Ivri, that Kol Olam be'ever echad, v'Avram be'ever sheni. Abraham was on one side, and in other words, it spoke about Avram being unique, being an individual. And we have to understand why at that point is the emphasis on Avram being an individual. And it's interesting. The Gemara tells us that when Avram conscripted his people, those who were part of his camp, to join in the battle, so the Gemara in the Durham says that he did not act properly, because in a sense he took Talmidei Chachamim. The way the Gemara is perhaps simply understood, the Maharal has an altogether different explanation, but he took Talmidei Chachamim away from their learning Torah. And it wasn't proper of him, at least to pressure them to join him in the battle, to free Lot. And without going into the issue about drafting yeshiva boys or not, that it would require a whole shir in itself. The question is, was this a Milchemes Mitzvah, or wasn't it the Milchemes Mitzvah? Because we have a general rule by Milchemes Mitzvah Hakol Yotzen. Everybody goes out. Afilu chasa mechupasa v'kala mechedra. Now there is a similar Gemara in Sota. There the Gemara doesn't speak about Lot and Avram, but it speaks about Asa, who is the Melech Yehuda, who is the king of Yehuda. And there was like a civil war that took place between Yehuda and Yisrael. And the king of Yisrael, he made a barrier, a wall, whatever you want to call it, around certain areas in order to block the king from Yehuda. And the king of Yehuda, Asa, he drafted Kol Beis Yisrael, Kol Beis Yehuda, the whole house of Yehuda, and because he drafted the whole house of Yehuda, Chazal say that he drafted the Talmidei Chachamim as well. Ein Naki, no one was exempt. Ein Naki, Kol Beis Yehuda Ein Naki. And because of that, he was overcome with the illness that affected his feet. And the Gemara tells us, so the question is, was that and similar to what happened with Avram, who was punished? Now, Avram was punished for conscripting the members of his household who were involved in the learning of Torah. So he was punished, that as a result of not acting in the proper manner, so his descendants became slaves in Egypt. And so there is a machlokes. But in regard to Asa, there is a machlokes, whether it was a Milchemes Mitzvah or not. From the Aruch, it appears that it was a Milchemes Mitzvah. Excuse me. The Aruch says that from the Aruch it says that the Aruch says because. You see, even he drafted even the women, and if he drafted the women, he certainly drafted the Talmidei Chachamim also, and because Asa drafted the Talmidei Chachamim, so that's why he was punished. Now there's an interesting story, and I think this Aruch sheds light on the story. Many years ago, Ben Gurion wanted to draft the women into the army, into the Israeli army, and he wanted to draft the religious women into the army also. And at that time, the Brisker Rav took a very strong stand. The Brisker Rav in general was against participation in all kinds of protests. He felt getting involved in protests was a danger. But when it came to this decree, this gzeira, as he saw it, that the Jewish women will be forced to join the Israeli army. So and there was one other case also where this is based, what I'm saying now is based on hearsay, but he approved, I was told, he approved of demonstrations. And and at that time, he became very much involved in the effort to stop this law from taking effect of drafting the Jewish women into the army. And at that time, there was a Rav Zev Siegel. He was a rabbi in New Jersey, and the Brisker Rav, he had a lot of connections. He had many connections in the Israeli government. At one time, he was president of the Rabbinical Council of America. I don't remember if that was before this incident. It was probably afterwards. But he had a lot of connections in the Israeli government. And the Brisker Rav used him as his go-between to negotiate with the members of the Israeli government that were involved with this decree. And the negotiations, at first, I was told by members of his family, again, all this is based on what I heard, that at first, the Brisker Rav, he was concerned, because it wasn't someone he had been involved with. But after a while, he felt he built up a certain sense of confidence with Reb Zev Siegel, and the Reb Zev Siegel periodically would give him reports about what was going on. And then Ben Gurion, realizing that he probably would not be able to draft the religious women into the army, issued a threat. He was a very smart politician, Ben Gurion. And he said, or whether he did it personally or it was through somebody else, I don't know. I was very young at the time, and I wasn't aware about all this. I found out about this later, and again, from secondary sources. And they were talking about, as they are now, talking about drafting the yeshiva boys. And the yeshivas were very concerned about that possibility. And I was told that at that time, the Vad HaYeshivos in Eretz Yisrael had a meeting with Rab Zev Siegel, and they told Rab Zev Siegel that he's been involved in something very important, trying to stop this decree or this law that would require all Jewish girls to join the Israeli army. But now there is an even more important issue. And that important issue was that 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 the issue was the drafting of yeshiva boys. Anyway, shortly afterwards, apparently the Brisker Rav heard about this meeting that took place between the Rashi Yeshivas and the Vad HaYeshivas of Eretz Yisrael and the Rosh Yeshivas of the Vad HaYeshivas in Eretz Yisrael and Reb Zev Siegel, and he had a meeting with Reb Zev Siegel, and he said to him that it's better that all the yeshivas close down than one Jewish girl serve in the Israeli army. That's the way I was told. Again, it's all based on secondhand sources. Now he was not saying that he was in favor of them drafting the yeshiva boys, but he considered the drafting of the Jewish girls into the Israeli army to be a greater danger and to be a greater concern than even the drafting of the yeshiva boys. So then Reb Zev Siegel went back to the United States for a while, and he said, and then he got a call from a certain Rosh Yeshiva, one of the outstanding Rosh Yeshivas in the United States, and for that matter in the world, and who said that he wanted to meet with him. And that Rosh Yeshiva, so they met, and Reb Zev Siegel, he said, I want to know everything the Brisker Rav said, I word for word, as much as you can, exactly how he said it. And when he mentioned this comment that the Brisker Rav said, that it is better that all the yeshivas close down, and not one Jewish girl be forced to serve in the Israeli army, so that Rosh Yeshiva said, Sheker v'chazav, Sheker v'chazav. This is what I was told. And so Reb Zev Siegel said to that Rosh Yeshiva, I'm just repeating to you what he told me. If you have questions about it, call somebody to ask him. Brisker Rav, I doubt, matter of fact, I heard, at least for a long period of time, he didn't have a phone in his house. But so I assume means you make contact with him and you'll find out if he said it or not. Anyway, Reb Zev Siegel, in the next trip that he had to Eretz Yisrael, he checked in at the hotel that he was staying, and there was a message at the desk. Apparently, in Eretz Yisrael, they know who's coming and who's going before they come and go. And there was a message at the desk, the Rav wants to see you. The Brisker Rav wants to see you. Okay, he immediately went to the Brisker Rav, and the Brisker Rav said to him that what I told you, he says, you should know it's not just me that said it, but it's the Ramban. Now, the Ramban doesn't say exactly that, but the idea was the same. The Ramban says, the Torah says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu does not take shochat, does not take bribery. And the question is, what is the Torah telling us that HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't take shochat, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't take bribery? How does one even imagine that they could give bribery to HaKadosh Baruch Hu? And the answer is, sometimes people will say, I'll do an Aveira in order to do a mitzvah. That would be bribery. You'll be rewarded for the mitzvah you'll do, and you'll be punished for the avera you do. The implied message was that the yeshivas. The implied message was that the implied message was that the yeshivas that keeping the yeshivas open, making sure that the boys are not drafted into the army at that time, was important, certainly from the Brisker Rav's perspective, but that is not a reason to allow or not to work towards stopping the girls from being drafted into the army. Now, if we take a look, it's interesting, but when the Brisker Rav talked the first time to Reb Zev Siegel about it, the way it was said over to me, was he said, it's better, went a step further, it's better that the yeshivas closed. I guess better is not a good word. It would be worse for the girls to be drafted into the army than for the yeshiva boys to be drafted into the army. So, in a sense, we see that the Aruch says that, because by Asa, where there was a war, and Asa, there was a war, and Asa was punished. Why? Because he drafted the Talmidei Chachamim. He drafted the Talmidei Chachamim. And the question is, where do we see that he drafted the Talmidei Chachamim? So the Aruch says, because it says Ein Naki, which means, without going into all the details, that he drafted the women. So if he drafted the women, he certainly drafted the Talmidei Chachamim. So you see from the Aruch, if there is a choice, who should be drafted? The women or the Talmidei Chachamim? Of course, whatever the situation might be, and it could be in that situation, clearly in Asa's situation, he should not have drafted any of them. But we see that it was preferable. Again, I shouldn't say preferable, that it's worse to draft the women. It's worse to draft the women than to draft kafil chasam mechupasa v'kala mechedra. So it's worse to draft the women and the chasanim than it is to draft the Talmidei Chachamim. So what the Brisker Rav said really has foundation in the Aruch. However, the Marsha. So now he drafted the women, and it seems that he was not correct. He was not correct in drafting the women, or that. So it was a Melchemes Harishus. Asa's war was a Melchemes Harishus, it seems. And then the Marsha says also there was a Melchemes Harishus, but he deduces it from something altogether different. It says Kol Beis Yehuda Ein Naki. So he says from Ein Naki we see that you can draft the Chasan and the Kala, and not that you can, that he did draft the Chasan and Kala, and Kol Beis Yehuda, there we see that he drafted the Talmidei Chachamim also. So it's two separate things. One is not based upon the other. It could be that that Rosh Yeshiva felt, or the Vad Rosh Yeshivas felt like the Marsha, whereas the as the whereas the Brisker Rav felt like the Aruch. I don't know that we can make such an analogy, but I'm just pointing it out. Okay, so the question is, okay, so in the Melchemes, so in the Melchemes Harishus, you cannot draft Talmud. But there are those who disagree. Later Achronim disagree. I'm not going to go into the names of the Achronim that say that, but there are Achronim who say that you shouldn't draft Talmidei Chachamim even in a Melchemes mitzvah. Now, as for, even in a Melchemes mitzvah, from the Yerushalmi, however, at the end of Sota, it appears that Asa's war was a Melchemes mitzvah. So, because the Yerushalmi brings a raya that by Melchemes mitzvah, the Melech can draft everybody. So by Melchemes mitzvah, and he mentions that Asa drafted everybody. So then we have a contradiction between the Bavli and Yerushalmi. Okay, but that's not our topic right now. But if we assume, so the question is, was the war by why is it that Abraham? Why is it that Abraham drafted his household, the people who work for him, the member of his household? Why is it that he drafted them? Now, what was Avram's rationale from drafting them? Now, I want to discuss, now, there is an interesting, in the Haggadah of Pesach, in the Piyutim, at the end of the Haggadah, in Vayihi b'chatzi halayla. Now, this piyut is a very early piyut. It was probably written 1,300 or 1,400 years ago. It was written by Yanai. It's one of the earliest piyutim that we have. And it says there, Ger tzedek nitzachto kenechlak lo laila. So when it talks here about Avram when he went to save Lot, so you made Avram victorious when he divided his company at night. So the Avram was victorious. So now it refers here to Avram as a ger tzedek, that Avram was a righteous ger. So the question is, and we see discussions in the Rishonim about it, whether Avram was considered a ger at that time. Was Avram considered a ger altogether? Now, the Das Geinim Mibal HaTosfos in Parshas Chayesara mentions that Turah, when Avram married Turah, and we know that Turah was Hagar, and Hagar was the daughter of Paro, and Paro was an Egyptian, and there is a prohibition of marrying somebody, even a ger, for 3 generations who had Egyptian origin. So how was it that Avram was able to marry Hagar? How is it that Avram was able to marry Hagar? So to marry Turah, but when married Hagar, it could be at that point he was not yet, because we know that the Avos observed Kol Torah Kula. The Gemara tells us in Yuma, that they observed the whole Torah. So how is it that that Avram was able to marry an Egyptian? You're not allowed to marry a ger for who was an Egyptian. So the Das Kanim about Tosfos answers that he was able to marry Keturah because Avram was a ger, and the halach is that a ger can marry psulei kol. Ger can marry someone who there would be an Isur to marry. And then the Das Kanim Baal Tosfos gives another teretz that it's possible that Avram married Avram. The reason Avram married Hagar was al pi hadibur. In other words, it married the Keturah. In other words, he received, so to say, a message from heaven that he would be allowed to marry Hagar. Okay, the Brisker Rav, when somebody mentioned this teretz, apparently the person, well, I'm sure the Brisker Rav knew the Das Kenim Baal Tosfos, but the person said over the answer, apparently not the name of the Das Kenim Baal Tosfos, and mentioned it to the Das Kenim mentioned it to the Brisker Rav, and the Brisker Rav took exception to it. He gave his own teretz. I don't want to go into that teretz now, but the Brisker Rav said that Avram wasn't the ger. It's true. I mean, he didn't mention it, but the Gemara in Chagiga says, I don't know, maybe the Brisker Rav did mention it. It's not mentioned in the Sfarim that bring this conversation down that he mentioned it, the Rishon Legerim, but it just meant that he, as the Rishonim explain it, that he underwent Milah to become a Jew. But he wasn't a ger. He says a ger, the way I understood what the Brisker Rav said, is an immigrant. A ger is somebody that joins a group. But Avram was the foundation of the group. And I want to explain what the Brisker Rav probably meant. I heard from my father in a drasha. Matter of fact, I mentioned it before Sukkot. Our aunt Sukkot this year that I gave, that my father was talking about the two themes of the holiday of Sukkot. One was the Chag HaSukkos, when people sit in the sukkah. When people sit in the sukkah, they're exposed to nature. They're insecure. The other is the Chag Osef. It's the harvest holiday. Harvest, you take in your wealth, the product that you grew. One talks about a person not having roots, a person exposed to nature. The other is, on the contrary, taking in from nature, a person having roots. And my father mentioned at that time that Avram Avinu, when he met with the Bnei Ches, he said, "Ger v'toshav anochi imachem." I am a ger, an immigrant. V'toshav, I'm a resident, I'm a citizen with you. You know, it's Avram was expressing about himself, but it's, my father would say, it's true about every person. Every person on one hand is a ger. A ger is someone who doesn't have roots. He's an immigrant. On the other hand, the toshav is somebody who has roots. He's a resident. He's a citizen. He's an ezrach. And people who think they're ezrachim, they have to realize that they're gerim also. They are insecure. My father mentioned this. This was shortly after John Kennedy was assassinated. And my father said, who was more protected than John Kennedy? But Ezrach b'Yisrael Yeshu Basukos. We have to know that even though we have roots, we're citizens. We are insecure. And there are those. So that's that. And my father said, where does the word ger come from? My father mentioned, I think he mentioned the name of an Ibn Ezra, that the word ger comes from the word gargir, a seed. A seed is something that doesn't have roots. My father would say seeds could be tossed by the wind. So every person is like a seed that doesn't have roots. On one hand, that's the idea of every person being a ger. And on the other hand, every person, well, people, I shouldn't say every person, but most people are also, they have roots. And my father said that this is the idea. A ger is someone who doesn't have roots. Now it's interesting. There is a machlokas rishonim. The Gemara says in Yavamis that after a bezdin meets with a ger, and they question him, and he accepts all the mitzvos of the Torah and everything, and they see that he really is sincere, committed, no ulterior motives. So molino sumiyad, we start the process of gerus right away. We do the bris milah right away. So the Gemara says, and the Gemara says, why are you telling me this? So the Gemara says, because to emphasize that you don't push off doing mitzvos, accepting him as a ger, initiating the process of gerus, having him have the bris milah where it's a male ger. That's part of the mitzvah of accepting gerut. And the question is, and truth is, you have to be very careful who you accept as a ger. But some of the words that were used in warning Jews about being careful, I think, overstepped the line. You do have to be very careful. We very often suffer because, as the Rambam tells us, because some of the gerim who are not careful about, of course, those gerim that are proper gerim, they're a bracha for Klal Yisrael. They're a big bracha for Klal Yisrael, a blessing for the Jewish people. But those that somehow remain attached to their former way of life very often can cause problems for the Jewish people. So you have to be careful who you accept. But in sometimes there is an attitude, or I shouldn't say there's an attitude. It's expressed, and perhaps they have a reason to express it that way. They say, no one says that you have to accept them as gerim. That's not true. If somebody is right to be a ger, you're required to accept them as a gerim. Not only you're required to accept them as a ger, you have to do it as soon as you're convinced. As soon as you're convinced. Now, obviously, what these people meant is wait till you're convinced. But once you're convinced, you should not postpone. You can't postpone a mitzvah. And the Rishonim are troubled. What is the mitzvah of accepting gerut? Of course, it's a mitzvah. The Gemara says the mitzvah. But they want to know what the mitzvah is. And I saw that there are two shitas brought down in the Rishonim. One shita is the shita of Rabbi Yehuda Bar Tzolani. His opinion was that the mitzvah of accepting a ger is AHAVAS HASHEM. You have to show love to the ger, devotion to the ger, over and above the mitzvah of Ahavas Yisrael that applies to a ger. Now, however, the question is, we're talking about speeding up the gerus, not postponing the doing of tefillah. So we're dealing before the tefillah, before he went into the mikveh, or before the bris milah. Excuse me, before the bris milah, and even after the bris milah, he's not yet a ger until he goes into the mikveh. And of course, according to most Rishonim, even on a diaraisa level, the bris milah comes first, and then you go into the mikveh. So how do you say it's a mitzvah avas a ger? He's not yet a ger. He's not a ger until they go to the mikveh. And here, this person is first having the bris milah. He's first having his circumcision. So he's not yet a ger. So how can you say AHAVAS HASHEM, love of the ger? So that's one question. And then there is a Ravid. The Ravid says, he mentions a pasuk in this week's Sedra, that where is the mitzvah? The mitzvah is at the beginning of this week's Sedra, that Avram, when he left to Eretz Canaan, to Eretz Yisrael, the souls that he made in Haran, the people that he had an influence, he took with him. What does it mean he took with him? The nefesh yeshar. He was Megayer Gerim. Now the question is, at that point, so here we see a mitzvah to do gerus. And the question is, what's the mitzvah of gerus here? Here you're talking at that point when these people were in Haran, when he made their souls, whatever it is. So there was no gerus yet. Maybe there was certainly no ger tzedek. They didn't become Jewish. There was no Jewishness yet when he was in Haran. They were ger toshav, maybe. They accepted the 7 mitzvahs of Bnei Noach. So how can we learn out from here the mitzvah of gerus? Now, obviously, this is based on the Shita, on the Sifri of AHAVAS HASHEM in regard to the mitzvah of love of God. So the Sifri says the mitzvah of loving God manifests itself in a number of ways, but one of the ways is that it manifests itself is have ka'Avram, be like Avram, who brought people tachas kanfei hashchina, who brought him under the wings, who brought people under the wings of heaven. So just like Avram was made nefashos, made souls in Haran, brought them under the wings of heaven. So too here, there is a mitzvah to bring people closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, like Avram Avinu. But the question is, where do we see here a mitzvah of making people gerei tzedek? Okay, now, and then there's another question in regard to gerus, and that is that when we do gerus, when we do milah on a ger, bris milah, we circumcise a male ger, we make a bracha, lomo les hagerim ulahatif mimenu dam bris, to circumcise the ger and to take and to do hatafis dam bris. Now the question is, the gerus isn't done till he goes to the mikveh. The circumcision comes before he goes to the mikveh. So how can we say lomo les hagerim, to mal the ger as if he is a ger already? He isn't a ger yet. My uncle, my mother's brother, Rabbi Yisrael Shurin, in his sefer, he suggested an answer, but I'm going to suggest something different. He suggested, because Rabbi Avram Ger Tzedek, he was the ger in Vilna that was, because he converted to Judaism, he was burnt at the stake, and he was very close with the Vilna Gaon. Rav Avram Ger Tzedek. He came from a Polish noble family, but there's many stories about him. But because he converted to Judaism and refused to renounce his gerus, so he was burnt by the government and by the church. But he once said, the Medrash says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, at the time of Matan Torah, went to all the nations of the world, and he asked them, do they want to accept the Torah? And each one rejected it for their own reason. Yishmael rejected it because they couldn't accept lo sigzol, you shouldn't steal. Esav accepted because it's lo shirtzach, you shouldn't murder. They each rejected it. Each nation rejected it. Others rejected it because of immorality, whatever it is. They felt that they couldn't live up to the commandments of the Torah. But Rav Avram Ger Tzedek said, and everybody repeats in his name, and I heard the same thought from Lubavitch Chassidim in the name of the Baal Tanya, so that there was a minority in each nation that accepted the Torah, but they weren't the majority. But the descendants of that minority, they became Gerim. So in other words, the origin of their Gerus, my uncle Rabbi Yisrael Shuren said, the origin of their Gerus was at the time of Matan Torah. So to a certain degree, they were Gerim at the time. At the time they started their Gerus. That was the answer he gave. I want to suggest something different, but there probably is a connection. Now, the word ger, as I mentioned, my father said, the word ger means a seed that doesn't have roots. But a Jew, a non-Jew, who converts to Judaism, besides adopting Judaism, he separates himself from his previous background. So, in a sense, a ger is a ger for two reasons. He's a ger because he cut himself off from his previous roots. And he is a ger because in the Jewish people, to a certain degree, he's the beginning. Of course, everybody, all gerim are descendants of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. But certainly genetically, he is the first generation of Jewishness, so he doesn't have roots among the Jewish people either. He's accepted by the Jewish people. He's beloved by the Jewish people. B'ahavtem es hager. On the contrary, b'ahavtem es hager, we have to recognize what they did. My father and my uncle would say that when a ger joins the Jewish people, it's a chesed. Of course, it's a chesed. It's a chesed to. That's why the gerus is identified with Rus. Rus talks about chesed. Megillas Rus talks about chesed, and it's a chesed to the Jewish people. And it's a chesed to the Jewish people that the ger joins our people. They give us chizuk. They strengthen us when they join our nation and our people. So the ger, why? Because it was a big sacrifice for them. They had to cut themselves off from their roots, and they joined a group that they didn't have roots in. So we have to recognize the chesed that they did for us. So I think a ger is a ger for two reasons. He cut himself off from his previous roots, and he doesn't really have biological roots in the Jewish people yet. And I think when we think about gerus from Avram, even if we say that Avram is the foundation of the Jewish people, he is the root of the Jewish people, but he cut himself off from his background. And that's the beginning of Parshas Lecha. Lecha meyatzecha mimoladcha mibeis avicha el aretz asher arekta. Go to the place that I'll show you. So the whole Chumash Vayikra, the whole Parsha of Lech Lecha is the process of the gerus of Abraham. It begins not so much with the formation of the Jewish people, but the cutting himself off from his background. Mi beis avicha. But he takes with him Lot. And eventually he has to cut himself off from Lot also. And it concludes with the Bris Milah. And there, that represents the conclusion of the process of Gerus Abraham. And in a sense, we could say that this, a ger, when he indicates that he wants to go through gerus, and certainly where we see that he's sincere, certainly when we see that he's sincere. So at that point, when he stands in front of the Bezdin and he talks about his sincerity, we see that he's sincere. So in other words, we recognize that he's cutting himself off from the people. So Memela, he's a ger at that point also. So Avram, even if you say like the Brisker Rav, that he wasn't a ger in terms of the Jewish people. He wasn't the ger in terms of the Jewish people. He was the foundation of the Jewish people. But he was a ger by virtue of the fact that he cut himself off from his former background, and to a certain degree we could say from all the other nations of the world. From all the other nations of the world, because the Jewish people stand alone. It's an Am Skula. The Jewish people in Am Skula, we stand alone. We stand alone spiritually. We stand alone politically. And we know when push comes to shove, there are very few people that come to help us. And even those who came to help us turn against us. Didn't we see I got so many calls from people who are Jewish, or some who were identified as Jewish and might not be halachically Jewish, that have Jewish fathers. I got calls from them that their best friends are cutting themselves off from them because of the incidents that are happening. So, in other words, gerus manifest. So, the Jewish people, even people who are identified as being Jewish, to a certain degree, they're cut off. They're cut off from their roots, from Metzius. And halachically, there are a ger when he comes and stands in front of the Bezdin. He has to show that the past is no longer part of him. That's the gerus, and that begins at Parshas Lech Lecha. Lech Lecha meyatzecha mimoladcha mibeis avicha. So Avram was a ger by virtue of that. So even a ger, even Avram, he might not have been a ger, but he joined the Jewish people by virtue of his cutting himself off from his past roots. So because of that, he can be considered a ger also. So that's the shita of the Das Genim Mibal HaTosfos. Since he entered the Jewish people by virtue of his cutting himself off from his roots, So Mamela, he's considered a ger in regard to marriage also. However, the Brisker Rav sheet is no. In order to have these halachas that you're able to marry psulei kol, people who otherwise you wouldn't be allowed to marry, a Mitzri, an Egyptian who converted. So then it has to be the gerus of Klal Yisrael. It has to be the being a ger of the Jew among the Jewish people. And I think so. This is the halacha, and this is what the Ravid is saying. I think perhaps the Ravid says, "Nefesh Sheras B'Charan." Avram was commanded. Those people who accepted mitzvos, he was commanded. He took with them. Why did he take them with them? In other words, he identified. He wanted them to identify with him. In a sense, he wanted them to even when someone is a ger toshav, he could still be connected to a certain degree with his past. But Avram wanted them. They did not yet undergo the gerus of bris milah and all of that. They didn't complete their gerus. But at that point, that was the maximum form of gerus. The maximum form of gerus was, at that point, the maximum form of gerus was cutting themselves off from the nations of the world. When they went with Avraham Avinu, they cut themselves off from the nations of the world. Avram thought because Lot went with him, so Lot cut himself off from the nations of the world. So he felt that Lot had the status of a ger, and that was the maximum form of gerus at that time. But Lot did not cut himself off. Lot had an attitude, and his attitude was Lot. Lot, yes, Abram took him, but Lot approach was, I'm going for myself. I'm independent. I'm independent of Abram. So Abram thought, by virtue of the fact, since that was the maximum form of gerus, he thought at that point, Lot was identified with him. So he had an attack on Lot was an attack on the nation of Abram, the group of Abram. And at that point, Abram felt whoever cut themselves off to join with him had a din as part of his nation. But ultimately, the completion of gerus came with the bris milah. So that's how we could explain this halacha, and that's why now it's interesting when the polit, the one who informs Avram that Lot was taken captive, so he comes to Avram HaIvri. This is the first time that Avram is called HaIvri. The first time that Avram is called to Ivri. In other words, Avram here is identified as being a someone who is separate from the rest of the world. Because a ger, when he cuts himself off, he not only cuts himself off from the nation, from his background, but to a certain degree, he cuts himself from all other nations as well. And let us see, look at the UN today. If we don't cut ourselves off to a certain degree, and we succumb to the nations of the world, we know what they do to us. We see what the UN did. They were involved in October 7th, and they don't apologize for it. They were involved in killing, murdering children and women. And then when they talk about discrimination of women, it was only after lots of pressure was placed on them. Who did they blame? They blamed the Jewish people. Only later on, did they include the October 7th. The UN was involved in it. So when someone comes a gear, they have to cut themselves off. So, and this is important to know, cutting oneself off doesn't mean not being concerned. You have to be concerned to everybody, especially if it was your parents and your immediate family. You have to be concerned about them. I'm not, a matter of fact, the Medrash says that Avram, before the Torah says, Avram, before, that Avram, Moshe Rabbeinu, before he went back to Mitzrayim, before he went back to Egypt, he told HaKadosh Baruch Hu he has to get permission from Yisro. The question asked, okay, he has a debt to Yisro, but his father, Amram was in Egypt. If he has a debt to Yisro, he certainly has a responsibility to his father, Amram. So the Medrash says that we see from here that if somebody was taken in by somebody else and he was fed by that person and he was clothed by that person and he received protection and a house and everything from that person, he's chayiv b'chvodo yoser michvorav v'imo. He's required more to show respect to that person than to his father and mother. It doesn't mean that you have to treat him as your father and mother, but you have a debt, a greater debt to him. And Yisro, at least at that point, Yisro was not yet Jewish. And Amram was Jewish. He was the leader of the Jewish people in Egypt. Chayev b'chvodo of Yisro more than Avram. Yeah, you have a responsibility, a debt to the ones who brought you up, who fed you, who clothed you, and took care of you. There's no question about that. But you're not part of their nation. You have no connection with their group. And I'll tell you why I'm saying all this. Because we see, my father would always say, he says, there was a question that came up, who is a Jew? My father says a Jew is a Jew according to halacha, we know that. But what is the trait of a Jew? The trait of a Jew, my father said, based on the Medrash says, why is it that a Jew is called a Yehudi? Named after Shevet Yehuda, the tribe of Judah. Simple explanation would be that the reason it's called Yehudi is because he at that time, after the split of the kingdoms, most of the time we're talking about the people from Yehuda, and especially the Jews that we have today. And the second base Hamikdash, we're all for the tribe of Yehuda, Levi, Binyamin, but it was all called Yehuda. But the Medrash gives a different answer. The Medrash says, because Yehuda said, the Avdecha AHAVAS HASHEM. Because your servant, Yehuda, told Yosef, before he knew it was Yosef, I am responsible for this boy. I am responsible for my younger brother. So being a Jew manifests itself in the idea of responsibility for your fellow Jews. What I find very disturbing is when I talk to people, I say that we Jews of the United States have a special obligation to use our political power not to make the mistake that the Jews of the United States made in World War II. And we have to let them know, we have to let the government know that we're holding them responsible. I heard stupid statements like, well, I'm against what they're doing, but no, words mean nothing unless it's followed with action. The nations of the world, and America especially, if they know that the Jews in America will not stand up for the Jews in Israel, we can be sure for political purposes they're going to support the Arabs. You have to be a fool and you have to be stupid to believe otherwise. And in a sense, you have to show regard for those who are nice to you, those that brought you up, to your family members and all that. But you have to understand, let's say for American, and when I talk to others, they tell me, well, I'm voting in an American election. I can't vote on the basis of being a Jew. I have to vote on the basis of being an American. Well, that's ridiculous for two reasons. First of all, on the basis of being an American, usually what's good for Israel is good for America also. You see what's going on the college campuses today. It's not the Jews that started the demonstrations. It's not the Jews that threatened the others. It's not the Jews that cut off their friends, their non-Jewish friends. It's all the reverse. But there's another thing also, and that is that being a loyal citizen of whatever country you're in is part of being a Jew. The problem is we have to ask ourselves, is being a Jew for us part of our Americanism, or being an American part of our Judaism? If you think that being a Jew is part of your Americanism, so you will play a role. You'll be playing a role in allowing the enemies of the Jewish people, the anti-Semites, to do what they're doing. You could then you in a sense of joining the demonstrations on the college campuses. To be a Jew, to a certain degree, you have to cut yourself off. It doesn't mean cut yourself off literally. It means whatever alliances you have has to be part of your Judaism, not your Judaism part of your previous relationship. And this is, we are universalistic. We have regard for those who took care of us when we were younger and all that. And we have to show gratitude. And we have to show loyalty. Well, all that has to be part of our Judaism. It can't be the reverse. That's the halacha here by Geras. When you join the Jewish people, on one hand, you have to cut yourself off. Cut yourself off doesn't mean completely cut yourself off. It means that you have to recognize that everything that you had was part, that where it could be, not where it has to show them it can't be, has to be part of your Judaism. It has to be controlled and limited by your Judaism, not the reverse. You have to be a loyal American citizen because that's part of being a Jew in America. But the reverse, what can make you an ally of the enemies of the Jewish people, and long term, you will have played a role in the enemies of the Jewish people in their struggle. They're not fighting just against the Jewish people. They make it very clear they're against the government of the United States and life in the American way. Of course, there's much that can be improved in the American way, but it's something that has to be improved. It's not something that has to be destroyed. Those who are against the Jewish people, it's not that they want to change the American way. They want to destroy the American way. And those who say that they can't, that when they vote and when they act politically, they have to be motivated by being American. So they don't understand the idea of being a Jew. And in the end, they will not be an American either. Okay. There won't be any questions today because there is people that have to go to other places. So we'll have to end it here. Okay, thank you.